Okay, so I decided to do a series of kind of a reading through Karl von Clausewitz on war. This is one of the few texts that really has been written about war, which is kind of like a philosophical treatise on warfare. I know you have Sun Tzu, The Art of War, and so forth. So there's a few out there, but these kind of books are few and far between. People kind of have difficulty thinking of war in a through a kind of philosophical lens, and which is why I think there's so little text like this out there. So Karl von Clausewitz was a Prussian military general. Prussia really is somewhere that developed a kind of understanding of war, which is somewhat sophisticated compared to other places in the world. And, for example, you had Napoleon, who, when he took Prussia, he went to Frederick the Great's grave, who was a Prussian general in I think it was the 18th century, I believe. And he had a great amount of respect for Frederick's tomb, which is in Potsdam, in Germany, which I visited a few months ago. And people leave potatoes on the grave, which is an interesting thing to do. I don't know why they do that, but it's interesting. And anyway, so yeah, Prussia, it's not really somewhere we even think of anymore because it's all just Germany now. But it's a part of the world that really developed a strong sense of kind of theoretical understanding of military matters, which was more sophisticated, I think, than most other places in the world, which is why Clausewitz was from Prussia. So this was written in like the 1830s, 20s or 30s, I think. And so it's basically a kind of it's a book written, suppose in hindsight, of the Napoleonic Wars, and it's designed to be, I suppose, it's a book which addresses war, I suppose, somewhat universally, but as we'll see, but also kind of in a particular sense, it's coming from that perspective, that style of warfare. Of the early 19th century, early 19th century, late 18th century. So it's worth reading this, just because I've read the first chapter and it's actually really interesting, and it's worth kind of comparing. I think, do these ideas hold up today with the technological changes which have gone on, particularly with nuclear weapons? Do these ideas still have a kind of relevance to us today, or has the technology just made theory about war in the early 19th century completely kind of irrelevant? It's going to be that's kind of the question I'm going to be asking throughout this. So Clausewitz, the very first chapter, he starts off with a definition, and which is unusual, because typically philosophers don't start with definitions. Typically philosophers end with definitions or just negate definitions. Socrates was famous, obviously, for getting us to the point where we realize we can't kind of logically and verbally define something like justice and so on and so forth. Hegel, the phenomenology of spirit, the preface, he basically also just says to hell with trying to define things. So this is a weird thing to do, but maybe this makes sense because he's a military general, so you gotta kind of think like, he's kind of caught in the middle of a very practical thing as well. He's trying to be theoretical, but he's also trying to be very practical. And anyway, his definition of war is thus an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. So it starts with that definition. So I suppose we could expand on that and say something like war is where rational negotiation is not the method of agreeing what we should do. It's beyond that. It surpasses agreement. It surpasses contract. It surpasses convention. It's force. We're using force to get others to do what we will. So Clausewitz will begin with the topic of the use of force, how much force should be used, and which is, I think, a pretty relevant question today, because we see wars breaking out now in which the maximum technological force to be used would be nuclear weapons, but there's a kind of refraining from that use. I mean, talking the Ukraine-Russia war, right? Well, NATO-Russia, pretty much. You see a kind of warfare that's broken out that doesn't use nuclear weapons, but it still is using like deadly lethal force without using nuclear weapons. So we're in this peculiar kind of moment where we don't really know like what war is anymore, because it seems that we thought in the Cold War that war is the use of all your kind of technological power. That was the assumption in the kind of mid 20th century, and then nukes came about, and it was like, well, we can't have war anymore because the full use of our technological power will mean the destruction of the earth. Mutual deterrence. Ukraine war has kind of broken all those assumptions, and now we're in this kind of weird position where we don't know what war is really anymore. At least we know we know what it is when we see it, but we don't really know. We don't really have a kind of a kind of solid, reliable definition of it in terms of things like the use of force, how much force is used in proper war. You even see the Russians saying this isn't a war, this is a special operation. So like you see all these peculiarities coming out. Anyway, let's get into what Clausewitz has said. So he says that some people would like to believe the art of war is to make it as bloodless as possible, but he says that this is never really genuine, I suppose we could say. When one side commits to a kind of more moderate use of force and the other side doesn't, that side will always be in the losing seat, the losing side. So they will be forced to increase the amount of force they use. So therefore, you always end up with this kind of escalation. So again, that's sort of interesting to think about in our context, because like we had the Cold War, we had the nuclear deterrence era, and now we seem to be going into a time where some sort of proper warfare without the use of nuclear weapons is happening again. So it's like I suppose like that argument still stands, because if Russia, for example, used nuclear weapons in Ukraine, would NATO return fire with nuclear weapons? It's a good question, right? Certainly, if Russia used nuclear weapons against, like, Western Europe or America, there would be a return nuclear weapons. So I suppose that is completely true. In the context of Ukraine, there's a question mark over whether or not NATO would. So I suppose this argument does still hold. If full force is threatened against Western Europe, for example, there would be a use of nuclear weapons against, for example, Russia. I'm not saying this is going to happen. It's completely ridiculous for that to ever happen. It would never happen. But theoretically, if it did. So I suppose this still kind of holds. Clausewitz says, if wars between civilized nations are far less cruel and destructive than wars between savages, the reason lies in the social conditions of the states themselves and their relationships to one another. These are the forces that give rise to war. The same forces circumscribe and moderate it. They themselves, however, are not part of the war. They already exist before the fighting starts. To introduce the principle of moderation into the theory of war itself would always lead to logical absurdity. So, you like, especially in this time, I think the wars in Europe where there was kind of an ethic in Europe, kind of code of conduct. This is a peculiar area to think about because there's codes of conduct which aren't like legally or physically enforced. There's a code of conduct between the conduct of war, for example, between the Greeks in ancient Greece, between like Sparta and Athens, Thebes, and so forth. It's not written down necessarily. It's not enforced by like a kind of overseeing pan-Greek authority that can punish you or fine you or jail you or execute you if you break those kind of conducts of war. But within specific regions, I suppose somehow spontaneously a code of conduct develops. And I think ancient Greece is a good example of that. Europe in this time, kind of Napoleonic era Europe was a good example of this. I know when Napoleon and the French went to Egypt, conquered Egypt, and we're sort of dealing with the Turks, the Turkmen as well in that kind of region. These sort of horseback rider Turkmen kind of people. Often the Turkmen people would do things which was just unusual for Europeans. Like Europeans at that time were very used to kind of pitched battles, kind of regimented, disciplined, pitched battles. But the people in that region of the world were kind of more ambushy, like they'd come in on horses and they'd shoot you and they'd run away again, blah, 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 blah. It's a very different kind of style of warfare, and if you read about what was going on at that time, often it was very confusing for a lot of the French soldiers who didn't really understand why there wasn't like a pitched battle, and also other things like sometimes issues with like taking prisoners, for example. Like the Europeans, I mean, they would take each other as prisoner, and like I don't know what they would do exactly. I think they would hold you for a certain amount of time maybe, and then send you back, or you would be ransomed. But there wouldn't be any like torture, or there wouldn't be any like executions, I don't think, generally. If you're talking like Prussia-Franco wars or something like that, right? But when they went to Egypt, like if these horsemen were to kind of capture some straggling French soldiers, they could be tortured, executed, or even raped, I think, in some cases. Stuff that wouldn't happen in Europe. So there is a kind of spontaneous conduct of war that happens between groups, which is not necessarily enforced or written down. It's just kind of implicit. And I suppose this has to be there like before the war begins. Like you can't like in a war between like in that time like Napoleon's French military and the groups in the Middle East. You couldn't like come in suddenly then and be like, okay, like no raping prisoners, please. Like you can't come in like in the middle of it and enforce rules. Those rules kind of have to be there implicitly before the war even begins. So that would be a good example of what Clausewitz is thinking of here. All right, so Clausewitz will say that there's two different motives that make men fight each other: hostile feelings and hostile intentions. He says our definition is based on the latter, since it is the universal element. Even the most savage, almost instinctive passion of hatred cannot be conceived as existing without hostile intent. But hostile intentions are often unaccompanied by any sort of hostile feelings, at least by none that predominate. Savage peoples are ruled by passion, civilized peoples by the mind. Okay, so interesting again to think about like Europe at that time, because it's had a kind of peak stage of civilization, and there's a distinction then drawn between the kind of savages and the civilized people, the barbaric people and the civilized people. One being more dominated by the mind, one more than the intellect, one being more dominated by the passions and feelings. But Clausewitz will kind of say, generally this is true, but like it's never completely true. there's a kind of gradient of truth to it. So he'll say that the difference lies not in the respective natures of savagery and civilization, but in their attendant circumstances, institutions, and so forth. The difference, therefore, does not operate in every case, but it does in most of them. Even the most civilized of peoples, in short, can be fired with passionate hatred for each other. Consequently, it would be an obvious fallacy to imagine war between civilized peoples as resulting merely from a rational act on the part of the governments, and to conceive war as gradually ridding itself of passion. This is a really good, important topic here. 1 second, I'll keep reading though. So that in the end, one would never really need to use the physical impact of the fighting forces. Comparative figures of their strength would be enough. That would be a kind of war by algebra. Theorists were already beginning to think along such lines when the recent wars taught them a lesson. I presume he's talking the recent wars here, the Napoleonic Wars. I'm not entirely sure though, because there isn't a footnote on that. Anyway, if war is an act of force, the emotions cannot fail to be involved. War may spring from them, but they will still affect it to some degree. And the extent to which they do so will depend not on the level of civilization, but on how important the conflicting interests are and on how long their conflict lasts. Okay, so, we have this distinction between the civilized peoples who are ruled by the mind and the savages who are ruled by passions. But this is a very general distinction, and like in war, I suppose war blurs this boundary a lot, is what he's trying to say too, because you can never have, even between civilized people, you can never completely have a rational warfare. He's saying as long as there's force involved, you're going to have some sort of passion. It's kind of impossible to avoid that. And in his time, there was already theorists which were imagining a purely rational war, which he thinks is kind of an absurdity. This is, and I would say like the reverse is true too, right? Like even savages, I suppose, like very, very like pre-modern sort of peoples. I don't know. Let's say Aboriginal tribes in Australia, before the English went and settled it in Australia, the kind of warfare they would have with each other, right? Even that sort of warfare has to involve some sort of rationality to it, some sort of intentions to it. A good text to read here is actually Lashes by Plato, because it brings up these exact topics, kind of warfare as a act of kind of passionate virtue, or warfare as kind of calculated affair. But anyway, another good topic to compare to this kind of post-war period, where we have drone strikes and economic warfare, and we have a kind of rationalist kind of hope, we could say, that you can get rid of the passion from warfare. You can get rid of the kind of intense, excessive emotional aspect of warfare, and you can have a purely rational warfare. You can have just drones attacking people and not people attacking people. You can use economic sanctions and so on and so forth. So this idea has been sort of tested out, like in its most extreme form, I think, within the late 20th and particularly the early 21st century. The Obama era in the US, where he was trying to decrease the amount of military personnel in the Middle East, for example, and trying to simply use drone warfare. And of course, the use of economic sanctions. Now, the interesting thing about our time now is that economic sanctions failed in trying to control Russia. Russia was able to resort to kind of more full-on traditional warfare in Ukraine, because the sanctions that normally kind of held them back. Or I'm not saying held them back like they're these great, aggressive people that just want to dominate everyone. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it could contain sometimes justified reasons to confront each other in a fully military sense. drones, technology, economic sanctions, those things were kind of really tested out in the kind of late 20th, early 21st century, and they seem to have not really worked to eliminate, any sort of passion from warfare. Now, the other interesting thing here you have too is, I'm going to use the Ukraine. Actually, no. First, I'll bring up Gaza and Israel. These dates. January 6th. No, that wasn't it. October something. All these dates nowadays of like things that happen, and everyone just refers to it by its date. 9/11, January 6th. When the Palestinians and Hamas sort of did a kind of very very kind of violent raid within Israel. I think it was last year. You see again like this failure to have this completely and utterly passionless version of warfare. Like the passion always comes through. Israel is a good example of this because they sort of have like a lot of advanced military technology, and they use a lot of the stuff like like drones and airstrikes and like precision weaponry, snipers and so forth, and they do kind of present themselves often as a military force which is not barbaric. It's sort of rational and advanced. And what happens is they just piss everyone off. They just make enemies because they kill innocent people the whole bloody time, and then that leads to a bunch of anger, obviously quite justified, and then that eventually bursts out, and you see a kind of regression to a very primitive kind of form of warfare conduct, something almost kind of medieval, and there's these regressions. I'll give you another example. Is India-China border. You have these border skirmishes, and people aren't allowed to bring any guns in there because if they bring guns, they shoot each other. Well, that could escalate. So you've got these soldiers who like carry around like sticks and batons, and they've actually had full-on confrontations where groups of people were killed. Because it's okay to do so with sticks and batons because it's not going to escalate and so forth. So you have these kind of peculiar reversals. Like technology doesn't necessarily bring us all the way to the point where like warfare is a completely passionless, rational affair. It actually sometimes brings us to the point where there's a kind of reversion back to something much older. So that's an interesting point of view, which I think is still relevant today. I think Clausewitz warning that warfare could not be this purely passionless affair is also quite turning out to be quite true today. The other thing I would bring up here is actually this idea that like this very simplistic idea that you have the rational civilized people, and you have the kind of passion fueled savages, right? And you see this again today in how Russia is talked about in regards to the Ukraine conflict. You have these kind of Western commentators who really perceive themselves as being the rational, civilized people, and perceive the rest of the world as being at least closer to the category of a barbarian than them. And there's always this kind of talk about Putin, for example, and the Russians, as if they're these sort of passion-fueled savages that need to be contained the whole time. But if you actually look at what their conduct in the warfare, that doesn't hold up at all. That doesn't hold up at all. I'm not saying that like they're justified in invading Ukraine or whatever, but they haven't unleashed like full-on force, technological capacity that they actually have at their means, and their conduct has not been this kind of completely brutal, savage affair. Like it has been relatively constrained, relatively tactical, and they waited 10 years after the Ukraine war, the Ukraine civil war happened before they went in with the military, and they obviously have a lot of patience and are obviously using their rational minds a lot in their conduct. So there's this kind of very stupid assumption here that there's certain people who are the civilized people that are ruled by the mind and everyone else is ruled by their passions. Well, it's not really always completely true. So that's another kind of contemporary phenomena which I think we could point to say that Clausewitz is, his theory here is quite good.